Hello ladies and gents, welcome to the channel. I am a Techie Smith and this is part 2 of a video that we're doing in a series called A Noob's Guide to PC Building. So today we're actually going to be putting together all the components that I mentioned in the first video. If you haven't checked that out yet, you can check it out in the link. And it just talks about why I'm doing this, why you might want to get into PC building, some things to think about and consider before you dive into that. And today we're going to be taking all of those parts, putting them together, and hopefully have a working computer at the end of it. So the first thing I just want to say by way of getting set up, before you get going, you want to make sure you've got a good workspace that's clean of clutter, that's got a good bit of space for you to work on. You also want to make sure you've got a good bit of time set off. The first time I did this build, it took about 3.5 hours or so. Granted, about 45 minutes of that was me squinting at a manual trying to figure out where to plug certain things in. So hopefully this will go a bit quicker, but setting off a good bit of time in the afternoon will make sure you don't get stressed out by trying to hit some sort of deadline, so it's the most enjoyable experience it can be. You also want to have your tools set up. So I've got here a number 2 Klein screwdriver with a magnetic tip, Phillips head. That magnetic tip comes in really handy when you lose a screw behind your motherboard. And then this little guy from Max Craft, it's got a replaceable screw heads that gets into the smaller screws that we get. I've got this guy here, which is just a magnetic bowl that keeps my screws and bolts and stuff from flying off and getting lost into the netherworld under a couch or something like that. And then I've got my mod mat. This just provides a clean surface that protects my countertop, but also protects my hardware and my equipment that I'm using, make sure nothing gets scratched. And obviously you want to have your components. Now that probably goes without saying, but you want to make sure that you've gotten everything that you need for the build. You don't want to get about 2/3 of the way through and realize that you're missing some component that hasn't arrived from Amazon yet and have to stop everything. So I've got all of my stuff here scattered about close at hand. So yeah, that's pretty much that by way of introduction. The parts list is linked below, so you can check that out. It's the PC Part Picker parts list. So let's get going. So this is our case that we're going to be building in today, and a couple things about this case just as we get going. First of all, this case came with the standoffs already installed for the ATX size motherboard. And depending on your case, manufacturer, and the size of your motherboard, you may need to adjust those or install those. It just really depends on how it came from the factory, but it is very important to go ahead and do that first off. The other thing about this is that this case came with 2 intake fans, and these also have the Phanteks halos on them for some RGB bling, which is always good. But it didn't come with an exhaust fan. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and install that exhaust fan. It's also good to make sure you're using the right screws for this. I wasn't initially. When I screw this in, I'm actually not going to screw it in all the way. I'm not going to secure it because I can't quite remember how this was oriented, where it was secured on this, and it's got a little bit of leeway, as you can see in that arena. All right, the next thing I'm going to say is in your motherboard you're going to get this guy. This is your I/O shield that's going to go onto your case, and even with veteran PC builders that have a good bit of experience, this can be forgotten, and you get into it and you screw in your motherboard into the case and you get ready to finish everything up, plug everything in, and you realize, crap, forgot the I/O shield, and you have to backtrack, take everything out, put it back in. So my recommendation is, as soon as you pull this out of your motherboard box, or as soon as you get your hands on it, go ahead and install that into your case. It's very simple. It just snaps in. And just make sure that you've got it oriented in the correct way. Okay, so that's pretty much all of the case prep that we're going to do. And so that's sorted out. The next thing we're going to move to is putting together all the things that go onto our motherboard. Alright, so let's take a look at the motherboard. And just a couple of things by way of geography. We've got our CPU slot here. We've got our DIMM slots here. This is the PCIe slot that we're going to put our not our motherboard, we're going to put our graphics card there. That's where that goes. There's an M.2 slot here and an M.2 slot here for storage drives. I'm only using one, so I'm going to be using the top one. One of the things that's different here about this is that I actually do already have the standoff installed. I just left that in there. And you also notice that just to keep track of it, I went ahead and installed the standoff and the screw for the other one in case I wanted to add that later. I wouldn't have to look for my screws because you don't want to have loose screws going around. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the CPU. Now, it's very important that you handle this with care. I mean, this is obviously the CPU, it's the central processing unit, it's the core component for your computer. The bottom of it has all of these gold connectors. These are very delicate. You want to make sure you avoid touching those because the oils from your fingers can cause corrosion and cause those to break down and not transfer the information. And the top as well, it's less delicate, it's the heat spreader, but the oils from your finger can cause that to be a little less efficient when you get your heat block on there. There's also a couple of things to notice if we look closely at the chip. The first thing is you've got this gold triangle there. Now that corresponds with this triangle here. It's the pin 1 indicator. That lets you know that that's how this is supposed to be oriented and set in. If we take this up and open it, we'll also notice that there's 2 little nubs here on each side. Those correspond with these little slots here. That's just there to make sure that you don't install this upside down or something like that. It's actually pretty hard to do because also when you put your CPU in, you do not want to put any insertion force in. You just hold it like this, line it up and get it as close to it as possible. You don't want to drop it in there either, and just set it in like that. All right, so then we're going to take this cover here and we're going to slide it down like that and make sure this tongue gets under this standoff here. And this does take a little bit of pressure to push down, so just push that little lever down and that. This guy will pop out. So one recommendation just for you is to save your motherboard box. You can put all of the extra screws and cables and things like that that came with your motherboard and other components. But you want to keep this guy. This little plastic guy is not trash. If you need to send your motherboard back for warranty work, this is going to be very important to keep because I think it actually voids the warranty if you do not ship it back with this. And also if you're going to upgrade at any point in the future and sell your motherboard, you'll want to ship it with that. So don't throw that away, keep it in your motherboard box so you'll always know where it is. So that's the CPU. It's simple, not too intimidating, and we got that in there. So next we're going to move to the RAM. Okay, so when it comes to your RAM, there's a couple of things just to be aware of. If you're using, here in this case, on this motherboard, we've got 4 DIMM slots for the RAM. So if you're using 4 sticks of RAM, a 4x4 kit, or a 4x8, or 4x16, which is the most this would take, this motherboard only supports 64 gigabytes of RAM, so it would only take up to 4x16. What I'm using here is a 2x8 kit. So it is important which slot you put your RAM in. Your motherboard manual is going to tell you, sometimes it's actually printed on the motherboard itself, that tells you which one to use. In this case, it's slot A2 and B2, which are the 2nd and 4th ones from the CPU. So another thing to notice, you can probably see it, there's a little notch here, and that corresponds with the notch that's on the DIMM slot. And in this case, we only have this lock lever here. It's not on both sides. Sometimes it's on both sides. So you just want to make sure you've got that lined up correctly with that notch. There's only one way to do that, and you'll just slide that in there. And this does take a little bit of force to push down until you hear it click. So there's that one, and then rinse and repeat with the second one. All right, So there we have our RAM installed. So that's probably the simplest thing. That was actually the only thing that I had done really prior to doing this build, was installing RAM into a system. So next we're going to move to our M.2 storage drive. Alright, so this is a Samsung NVMe SSD 960 EVO. It's a 250 gigabyte model, and this is actually the boot drive that I'm using for this. It's got some of my main programs and such on it, but it's a super fast, super slick little drive, and it's almost identical to installing the RAM. There's a little notch you may be able to notice right here, and so there's only one way that you can insert this. And to install it, you're just going to come in at about a 45-degree angle, put some little push down into it, get that in there like that, and make sure that's secure. We got a little screw here, and this is where the tiny screwdriver is going to come into being handy. That's what it's going to be. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to hold this down and take this little screw, hopefully, and secure this little bad boy. Maybe today. This is a lot more fun doing it upside down and backwards, since I'm showing you guys. Now, one thing about screwing these things in, and this pretty much is the case for all of your components, you're not building a car here. This is not going to be vibrating wildly and all that kind of stuff. So you don't need to over tighten or put a lot of torque on these. You actually risk ruining your components by doing so. But anyway, at this point, we actually are looking at half of our components installed. We've got, if you remember from the first video, there's really 8 components that make up primarily any PC build nowadays. And we've got the first 4. We've got our motherboard, we've got our CPU, we've got our RAM, and we've got our storage drive. Alright, so I almost forgot, and this is something that's kind of important to do at this point, is install the backplate for your CPU cooler. Some cases, and this is the case with my case, have an open back motherboard plate, so you can access this from behind. But usually you just want to go ahead and install this. Now, your CPU cooler is going to come and it's going to tell you which orientation, if there's anything like this, which orientation setting these guys need to be in for the socket that you're using. I'm using an 1151 socket, so these guys are set to the 1151 space. And so to install this, it's very simple. We're just going to line this up with these holes in the back and get those in there and let this set down. Well, there we go. And we're going to take our little standoffs here that we're going to connect our and just go ahead and install these guys. You know, the first time that I did this, I was actually kind of nervous, most nervous about this. And this is one of the places, the main place actually, where I deviate from the original build. In the original build, the CPU cooler that I have, which is the Corsair H100i V2 AIO cooler, it comes with, as is the case with most CPU coolers, it came with pre-applied thermal paste. Which I've removed. There's a 2-step process for doing that, provided that I'll talk about maybe in another video. But in this case, I'm actually going to be using this Arctic Silver 5, which is some of the best thermal paste on the market. So we'll get to that in a minute. And so we've got that set up, and at this point what we're actually going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to install the motherboard into the case. Alright, so to install this, you're just going to put it in. Alright, so at this point we've got our motherboard installed and secured, it's screwed down and all that kind of stuff. And what I'm actually going to do now, which I'm actually kind of excited, is I'm actually going to go ahead and start routing some of the cables. Now the thing about cable management is it's kind of a a continual process. I tweaked it a number of times. You know, there was like one cable that was sort of hanging out that was sort of annoying me, and I finally just broke down and opened her back up and had to figure out a way to hide that. And that's going to be something that you're going to have to manage depending on your case, and your components and that kind of thing are going to provide different sort of options for how to hide things and make things look nice and clean. So as I mentioned, the reason why I'm redoing this build, the reason why I'm shooting this video is I decided to get some custom cables from CableMod, and just a little bit of a shout out to them. It's great. There's a link in the description below of the configurator that you can use there. You can select color schemes, lengths, the types of cables that you need and all that kind of thing. But I had to interact with their customer service on a couple of occasions, and having worked in customer service for a good long time myself, it is some of the best customer service experiences I've had. So shout out to CableMod. All right, so at this point what we're just going to do is we're going to install the 24-pin ATX connector and the CPU power cable that we have here. And one of the things about cable management is that it's best if you kind of try to do it as you go, as you're building, so it's not something that you have to run into at the very end. So we'll go ahead and do that. All right, so also at this point, I'm going to go ahead and try and connect up all of the little front I/O things. There's like a whole rat's nest of cables back here, and honestly this was probably the thing that took me the longest to deal with individually when I did the first build, because looking at this and trying to figure out where things go and so on. So since we've got an open case and we've got things pretty clean and a lot of space to deal with, I'm going to go ahead and put in some of these front I/O connectors and stuff like that. So we're going to route these guys to, again, the closest place to where they go. Alright, so I had to actually go back and take a look at the manual and a picture I took to cheat with this so I could get these guys plugged in. This is going to be very specific to your case and your motherboard, as to they're laid out fairly consistently, but depending on the specifics of what you're going to have, there's going to be a little bit of deviation. So that's going to be something that you just have to take a look at your case manufacturer and the connectors that it has, as well as your motherboard manufacturer. Look at the manual and where to set that. It's kind of printed on the motherboard, but especially once you get it installed into the case, it's very difficult to actually look at that and see what goes where. So I had to go back to the manual, but as you can see, we've got our audio, our USB, our HDD, LED, and our power, and as well as one of our case fan headers occupied here. So we've got all of that in, and that's pretty much all we can connect at this point. Okay, so this is our AIO. So like I said, it's the Corsair H100 IV2. Now I've actually made some modifications on this. I actually spent last night. This is also from CableMod. It's a sleeving kit, which gives a little bit more look at the way that I was wanting to go with this being a black and white sort of interior theme and so on. But I will say that it took me a good bit to, the sleeving is really easy to get on, but these little connectors here on the sides, they are less than simple to install. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to set the heat sink onto our CPU, and this is actually going to be oriented like this. So let's go ahead and get set up to do that. Alright, so the convention is, depending on who you talk to, is you're going to be looking at applying the thermal paste right on the center of the chip. And for this size chip, it's recommended that you apply about a rice to a small pea size shape. All right, that looks pretty good. Not exactly consistent. All right, so to get this guy on here, it's pretty straightforward. You just want to make sure that you are lined up with all of your screws here. So we're just going to make sure we're lined up on all the sides here, and we're going to put down there. All right. All right, so there we are. All right, so I'm gonna basically install this more or less in the center. That's kind of just what I decided to go with. I'm not going to tighten these guys down all the way for the same reason that I didn't tighten down the exhaust fan because I may want to adjust things once we get everything in here. But for now, we'll just go ahead and put this in so we can start moving on to the next step. All right, there we go. All right, at this point, we're actually going to go ahead and we're going to install our power supply, which is actually probably something that I should have installed already, but I skipped a step. But it's no big deal. All right, so what we're using here, and I love it, it's the UVGA 750 watt Supernova G2. It's a fully modular power supply, which really helps out because you don't need to use any cables that are not needed. So we're going to go ahead and we're actually going to plug in all of the stuff that we've got going on over here. All right, so I had to reroute some things there because they were kind of behind what we needed to do. So we're just going to slide this guy in like that. So that makes this pretty simple. All right, so as you can see, this is a hot mess at the moment. So we're going to definitely be cleaning that up. But I wanted to go ahead also and install our hard drive. So to do that, in this case, you've got these guys that just fly open like this. There's a little catch like that. And then you just set all right, see how easy that is when you do it the right direction? So, and obviously to install this guy into your case, you're just going to pop that in right there and it slots. So to install this, it's very similar to the RAM. There's a little slot here. You want to make sure that this little catch is pushed back here, and then you'll just line it up. I'll get these guys out of the way. You'll line it up with that. And you'll just go in until you hear, there we go. All right, so she's in there. You want to wait to install your graphics card, probably last or close to last, just because you don't want to end up putting undue stress or shear force on its the PCIe slot that it goes into. Those can break, and so it's best to do it like this when you can immediately go in and secure it. And so we'll go ahead here, and let me take this guy off here. All right, so now the fun part. The fun part now is to take all of this stuff. We've installed everything into the computer. So now all that's left to do is to connect everything and hopefully see if everything turns on and works when we get ready to power on the system. So. So I think everything is plugged in and everything is going on except for the additional RGB. So that is not set up. I'm going to save that for cable management when we do that here in a little bit. But at this point, I'm ready to go ahead and see if the system boots up to make sure before I go any further that I've got everything plugged in and everything is ready to go. So in order to do that, you're going to need three other things. You're going to need a monitor, and you're going to need a keyboard, and you're going to need a mouse. Alright, so at this point, just a couple of things. Like I said, you need monitor, mouse, keyboard. Also, very important to remember, especially if you've gone through the trouble and the expense of buying a high-end graphics card, don't plug your HDMI cable into your motherboard. Use your graphics card. So you make sure you got that. So at this point, we're just going to see if we can boot into BIOS. So I've got everything plugged in. We're going to turn on the computer on the back button there, and then we're going to hit the power button. So there we have our BIOS. Okay, so successful rebuild. We got to boot into BIOS, and there's some noise that's happening back here. I think something might be on a fan or something like that. There's a couple of things that I have to tighten up and reposition. Definitely have a lot of cable management to do, and I've got all the RGB bling to add to this. So we'll be doing that in the next segment. And but here we are, successful rebuild. Just a few things. If you enjoyed watching the video, definitely give it a like, or if you didn't, you can do the other thing. Leave questions or comments in the comments section below. Be sure to subscribe. I am the Techie Smith, and thanks for joining me.